Okay, we're going to do part 2 of section 1.1. Now we'll talk a little bit more about recognizing an argument, and if you know there's an argument there, then there's going to be premises and a conclusion. And so if you see premises and a conclusion, you got an argument, right? Okay, so how do you go about doing this? First thing I want to say is be careful here. And sometimes this is not as easy as you might think. And it doesn't mean that this is super hard, but this is a warning, okay? So let me just write that down, warning. Often I get a lot of students, they'll do section 1.1 and they'll go, oh, okay, premises, conclusion, I'm doing the exercises in the book, and there's chapter examples before you actually have the problems, and this is real easy. There's the premises, that's the conclusion. What I want to tell you to do is to be careful. Just slow down, because often students will get their first homework quiz back and test back, and they'll say to me, gee, Dave, I didn't do quite as good as I thought, and I know this stuff. That's because even though this stuff is not going to be that hard here in Chapter 1, you still have to be careful. Often people will go, oh, why did I say that was the conclusion? I got that problem wrong. It really was the premise. What I think students do is they assume, well, this is not terribly hard, so they're not careful. So if you're careful, you'll do better on these first quizzes, homework set number 1 and test number 1. If you don't do as well on this when you get your score back, often it is because you kind of rush through this. So my only warning here is just to slow down. You will not, you're going to misidentify premises or conclusions if you go through this a little too fast because you assume that it's not that difficult. It really is not that difficult, but you still have to be accurate and be careful, okay? So when you're trying to find, let's get back to identifying an argument after my warning there. Here's some things to keep in mind just about the real world. You think there's an argument there, or you're trying to decide if there's an argument. Here's some things to keep in mind. You know those nice indicator words I told you about? A lot of times arguments will have them, and they're going to help you find the premises, identify that conclusion. But sometimes you can have an argument that either doesn't have any indicator words at all, or they're not very obvious, okay? So if you have a situation where you think there's an argument, but they're not using therefore or since or because, you want to keep certain questions in mind to help you. You go, okay, I don't have these indicator words that are tipping me off real clearly what the conclusion is, for example. So I have to determine what the conclusion is in another way, and here's a good question. What single statement is claimed to follow from the evidence? So you look at this and go, what is the arguer trying to prove? What single statement seems to follow from statements that seem to be articulating evidence? What is the main point of the passage? That can kind of tell you what the conclusion is, how the argument's going downhill. You got your premises and they're used to go downhill to that conclusion. So sometimes if there's no indicator words, you want to slow down, read the statement. You don't want to get trapped into overanalyzing. That can get you into trouble too. But like I said, be careful and go, okay, I don't see these nice indicator words, but what really is this person trying to prove? Okay, that's probably the conclusion. So there is a subjective interpretive element here sometimes. Sometimes you're going to have some examples that's really straightforward. And I'll give you some examples here in a minute that are. So anyway, just be aware, often indicator words are not present or they're not so obvious, okay? Secondly, sometimes statements are embedded in paragraphs that are neither premises or a conclusion, okay? You can have an argument there, and then you can have other statements. They're not really being used for the argument that you think is there. They could kind of be in the middle of something. They're neither a premise or a conclusion, okay? So just because you have a statement there, I don't want you to make the mistake, oh, well, this has got to be a premise or that conclusion. No, sometimes people aren't real clear and they don't write their premises first, which is the convention that the book talks about, and then that conclusion at the end, and draw a line between the premises and the conclusion. So you can have statements embedded in paragraphs that are neither premises or a conclusion. So you've got to be aware of that. When restructuring some argument, you need to separate out compound statements into single premises. You know, you could have something like this. Since apples are juicy, and, you know, a compound statement, that's what they mean. And is your conjoining. And wood comes from trees, let's say. From trees. Well, if you're going to write this argument out, and remember the book, like I said, you list your premises first. This sense is a premise indicator word, and here you have a premise right here, apples are juicy. And you have really another premise here, wood comes from trees. You want to separate those out. Here's a premise, premise one, apples are juicy, wood comes from trees. I don't know what you would conclude with that. I'm just kind of putting, this is what they mean by a compound statement. Sometimes go ahead and separate them out. If you treat a compound statement, if it seems to be similar, the two parts of it, the two conjuncts seem to be similar, and you name it one premise, I'm not going to get that bent out of shape about that. But if they're distinct, if you're writing it out, just be aware of that. And you'll know if they're very different, apples are juicy, wood comes from trees, I'd separate those out. Often the premises appear after the conclusion. When someone's writing an argument, they could list the conclusion first, and I'll give you some examples, and then the premises after that. Okay, so be aware of that. You are going to rearrange them, premises first, and then write that conclusion. But when you're looking to see if there's an argument, you think there is, you're trying to find out what it is, so what are the premises, what is that conclusion? You can have the conclusion mentioned first. That's not uncommon, okay? Just when you rewrite it out in a formal sense to help you, what is the argument? So what are those premises? What is that conclusion? What's the implication there? You'll write premises first, conclusion last. You know, you'll do something like this, and we would come and erase that. But in the real world, and that's what this section is about, right? The real world, often someone lists the premises, the conclusion first. Okay, simple stuff here. Sometimes a single indicator word can be used to identify more than one premise, and that's exactly what happened here. Since apples are juicy and since wood comes from tree, this word since, a premise indicator word, applies to apples are juicy and to wood comes from trees. And I already mentioned it up there. A lot of times there are no indicator words, so that's kind of repeating what's up here. Okay? All right, so with the real world taken into account, things are basically not so cut and dry, and that happens in all fields. Let's go to some examples here. Okay? All of these are arguments, so there are arguments here, because you're going to be given some examples in Chapter 1 where you're going to be given an argument like this, and you have to identify the premise or premises and the conclusion. Okay? So let's look at these here. Tortured prisoners, example number 1, will say anything just to relieve the pain. Consequently, torture is not a reliable method of interrogation. Okay? So here's consequently. This is a conclusion indicator word, and this is fairly straightforward. So this is probably the conclusion, and it seems to read that way. They're bringing up, so this would be the conclusion, because I can read this. Tortured prisoners will say anything just to relieve the pain, and that's been brought up before in the newspaper and on TV. Seems to be a fact. So premise 1, or a bit of evidence. If you're being tortured, you will say anything to relieve the pain. Consequently, torture is not a reliable method of interrogation all the time, right? So this would be your premise: tortured prisoners, premise 1, and it's the only one, will say anything to relieve the pain. Therefore, at times, torture is not a reliable method of interrogation. Here's your conclusion. It seems to flow that way. This is what they're trying to argue for. And there's a conclusion indicator word. If you go to that page in Chapter 1, you'll see consequently, often when you see this word, the conclusion can follow. Okay, and here's another tip about arguments. People don't put forth arguments for things that are straightforward. Like, I want to argue that you see the sun every day rising in the sky. What are you going to argue about that for? We all know that, right? But, you know, is torture reliable or not? That seems to be something people want to argue for or against, so that even makes more sense that this would be the conclusion. And there's not as much controversy over the fact that if you're being tortured, you can say anything to stop the pain, even something that's not true. So anyway, here we have that conclusion indicator word. This is the conclusion, and there's the premise. Okay, let's go to the second example. Expected mothers should never use recreational drugs, since the use of drugs can jeopardize the development of the fetus. Okay, it's not disputed from doctors in the medical profession that certain drugs can endanger or jeopardize the development of the fetus, right? Too much alcohol, meth, cocaine, other kinds of drugs. Ask any parent, they don't want to take it, okay? That seems like a fact, and we see the word sense here, everybody. This is a premise indicator word. Okay, so here we have premise 1 is this statement: since drugs can jeopardize the development of the fetus, therefore, consequently, even though those are not there, here's your conclusion, okay? Expectant mothers should never use recreational drugs. Okay, and here, if you look at this argument, the conclusion is typed out first, right? It's the first sentence. Expectant mothers should never use recreational drugs, since the use of these drugs can jeopardize the development of the fetus. The premise is listed at the end. So there's an example of, you remember those tips about the real world, be aware of these things? Sometimes the conclusion appears first, okay? People don't write out arguments nice and tidy in the formal convention that a logic textbook tells you to do. You do that later just for clarity. But in letters to the editor, how people talk, it's not the way the real world is. Okay, let's go to the third example, and I'll read it here. It is vitally important that wilderness areas be preserved, for wilderness provides essential habitat for wildlife, including endangered species, and it is a natural retreat from the stress of daily life. Okay, when we look at this, you want to say, what are they really arguing for? And what is the evidence they're giving? Now, we do notice something here. The word for, and if you look in your book under your premise indicator words, that's a premise indicator word. So I'm thinking reasons are following, and this seems like it's the conclusion. It's vitally important. I am arguing that we preserve wilderness areas, and this will be something you'll have to argue for because it's expensive. It costs money. You're quarantining certain areas that you can't do certain things to, like cut down the trees or all that. And here's a premise indicator word. And so what are the premises? I would say this is the conclusion. It's vitally important that wilderness areas be preserved, because a certain patch of land, a certain chunk of acreage, you could have city councils, state governments arguing about whether that should be a preserve or not, or used for economic purposes or development or subdivisions, right? So it's ringing with that, as this is something you'd want to try to argue for, conclude, and you want to present evidence. And here's a premise indicator word, and these seem like facts you'd bring up to support the conclusion that we need to preserve this area. Wilderness provides essential habitat for wildlife. Okay, that could be premise 1. Including endangered species. Now you could, this endangered species, if you wanted to call the whole thing premise 1, fine. But if I was going to argue I wanted to preserve this area, I'd also say, there are endangered species here too. So I'm going to call this endangered species premise 2. But if you just wanted to lump it under it provides essential habitat for wildlife, including endangered species, and wanted to call that one premise, go ahead. And here's a compound sentence, but the four wilderness areas provide essential habitat. And 4 endangered species, and for the fact that it's a natural retreat, this indicator word applies to all of these sentences. It's a natural retreat from the stress of life. We could call that premise 3. Okay? So here you could either make this 2 premises because you just conjoin the first 2, or 3. So 3 premises, premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, and they're being used to argue for this, or you may just want to have it 2 premises. Okay? Let's go to the last example. The space program deserves increased expenditures in the years ahead. Not only does the national defense depend on it, but the program will more than pay for itself in terms of technological spin-offs. Furthermore, at current funding levels, the program cannot fulfill its its anticipated levels. Now here, there aren't really clear-cut conclusion indicator words or premise indicator words, but you kind of get a feel for this. What is something that's controversial that usually you would go before Congress and you want to give them reasons to argue, and that would mean we need more money for a program. So this right off is another example of the conclusion occurring first, and here seems to be reasons. Not only does the national defense depend on it, that would be premise 1, but the program will more than pay for itself in technological spin-offs, premise 2. Furthermore, this is like another reason, at current funding levels, the program cannot fulfill its anticipated potential. I would call that premise 3, is if you give us more money, we may have faster computers as a result of this, or more inventions. And because of these 3 reasons, this is I'm giving you these facts, Congressman, Senator, that you please increase our budget. Okay, so those are 4 examples, and heed my warning, slow down. This stuff is not that hard, but you still have to stare at what you think is an argument and make sure you get, okay, those are the premises, and that's the conclusion. I guarantee you, if you don't slow down and you're not careful, even though this is not difficult stuff in this chapter, some of you are going to get some problems wrong and go, why did I get that wrong? This stuff was not that hard. And then you're going to go, oh, that was the conclusion, and that really was not the premise. I see that now, but I rushed through this and I was not careful. Okay? So just be careful. We'll stop there and we'll go on to section 1, 2.